The longitudinal sulcus marks the division between the left and right ventricles of the brain. The central sulcus is a fold in the cerebral cortex in the brains of the sheep that separates the parietal lobe from the frontal lobe and the primary motor cortex from the primary somatosensory cortex. The lateral sulcus is one of the most prominent structures in the mammal's brain. It divides both the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe, which is above, from the temporal lobe, which is below. The frontal lobe is located at the front of each cerebral hemisphere and is positioned in the front of the parietal lobe and above the temporal lobe. The posterior border of the frontal lobe, the precentral gyrus, contains the primary motor cortex, which controls voluntary movements of particular body parts. The frontal lobe also contains most of the dopamine-sensitive neurons, which is responsible for reward, attention, short-term memory, motivation, and planning. The parietal lobe is located above the occipital lobe and behind the frontal lobe and central sulcus. The parietal lobe controls special senses and navigation. It is the main sensory receptor for the sense of touch in the somatosensory cortex, which is located posterior to the central sulcus. Other areas in the parietal lobe are responsible for language processing. The four cortical functions of the parietal lobes include two-point discrimination, which is the ability to discern that two nearby objects touching your skin are two actual distant points, not a single point. Stereognosis, which recognizes objects through touch alone. Grathyphasia, recognizing writing on skin by touch alone. And touch localization, which is bilateral simultaneous stimulation. The occipital lobe divides into different functional visual areas. The first functional area is a primary visual cortex. This cortex contains a low-level description of the local orientation, color properties, and spatial frequency within small receptive fields. The second functional area is the retinal sensors, which convey stimuli through the optic tracts to lateral geniculate bodies. This is where optic radiations move to the visual cortex. The temporal lobe contains the hippocampus and controls the formation of explicit long-term memory modulated by the amygdala. The temporal lobe is also responsible for auditory senses, visual senses, language recognition, and new memories.
The cerebellum is in charge of motor control. The cerebellum's main job is to contribute to our motions' coordination, precision, and accurate timing. It does this by receiving input from sensory symptoms of the spinal cord and integrates them into smooth motor activity. The cerebellum is also involved in the cognitive functions, attention and language, and in the regulation, fear and pleasure. The diencephalon, or interbrain, is where the embryonic neural tube gives rise to the posterior forebrain structures. The thalamus is a midline symmetrical structure within the vertebrate's brain, situated between the midbrain and the cerebral cortex. Its function includes relaying sensory and motor signals to the cerebral cortex and regulating consciousness, sleep, and alertness. Hypothalamus is a section of the brain responsible for hormone production. The hormones produced by this area of the brain govern body temperature, thirst, hunger, sleep, and the release of other hormones in the body. The epithalamus connects the limbic system to the other parts of the brain. Functions of this component include the regulation of emotions and motor pathways, and the emission of melatonin by the pineal gland. The brainstem includes the midbrain, pons, and medulla oblongata. The midbrain regulates body temperature, motor control, and sleep cycles. It also influences hearing, vision, and arousal. This region is responsible for controlling all responses related to sensory information and regulating the body's responses. The pons connect the upper and lower brain together. Its primary function is to relay messages from the cortex and the cerebellum. Without the pons, the brain couldn't transmit or pass along messages. Dreaming has been proven to originate in the pons. The medulla oblongata controls involuntary functions. Without its regulation and control over blood pressure and breathing and even swallowing, we as humans would not be able to survive. It helps transfer neural messages to the spinal cord. The corpus callosum is a thick band of nerves that connects the right and left hemispheres of the brain together. This is the largest area of white matter in the brain. All the myelin facilitated very rapid transmissions of information. It transfers motor, sensory, and cognitive information between the brain and the brain hemispheres.